Few hours from now, the year 2025 is going to end. And as of this time, the world's number one Stockfish is still crowned the king of all chess engines, followed by Lila Chess Zero, and the third one is called Obsidian. In this 11th episode of the series Clash of the Titans, I will be showing you a game between Stockfish and an engine called Ethereal. As far as I know, Ethereal is one of the strongest chess engine in the world, and it's playing the black pieces in this game. Now, let's just find out if Ethereal can really match with the mighty Stockfish. But before anything else, I would like to mention that in this game, there are so many variations. All is up to you if you want to explore all of them. But as a low-rated player, I would prefer to explore all of them because I believe that it will help me with improving my own games. Now, it is also worth mentioning that in this game, the engines demonstrates the importance of central control. It showcases that whoever dominates the center wins the game. Without further ado, Stockfish opens up with 1e4. Ethereal respond with c5, and we have the Sicilian defense on the board. Now, we all know that the Sicilian can be played in many ways. If you are the one playing with the white pieces, the usual continuation will be developing the knight to f3. However, some develops the knight to c3 first, and then followed by f4, then knight f3, and then bishop c4, and we will arrive in the Grand Prix style of attack in the opening. Some will also attack the center straight away by playing d4 and so on and so forth, but in this game, Stockfish continues with the move c3, and we have the Alpine variation of the Sicilian defense. The Alpine is the anti-Sicilian, is one of the anti-Sicilian opening. It is also one of my favorite opening against any Sicilian players in the past because it gives me the tactical opportunities as well as the traps if you are playing against it. Now, the game continue with d6, protecting the c5 pawn, and Stockfish strikes the center by moving the pawn to d4. Now, Ethereal continue with developing its pieces by hopping the knight to f6. Knight f6 is attacking the central pawn, which is undefended and vulnerable. Therefore, Stockfish defends this by playing bishop d3. Now, Ethereal adds another attacker by playing knight c6. Knight c6 attacks the central pawn d4, and Stockfish defends this by playing knight f3. Game continue with g6 with the idea of developing the bishop this way, and it is also called in the past the dragon variation. It will become only a dragon variation when this pawn is moved to a6 and the bishop is also developed here to e6. Now, the bishop on g7 is too strong because it dominates the dark square diagonal up to the queen side of the enemy's territory, and the bishop or the light squared bishop helps out with the attack. As we all know that the Sicilian is all about the queen side attack. Therefore, the bishop that is housed on g7 is too strong, and this three pawns, the black king is forming a small structure. Like I said, it will house the bishop and the king later on as soon as the black king castles short. It is a small house in the streets of the Sicilian. The game continue with bishop e3, and Ethereal hops the knight to g4. Now, if Stockfish ignores the threat is simple. The knight will be exchange with the dark squared bishop. Now, like I said, if Stockfish will ignore the threat and will just castle, then the continuation will be knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight, bishop h6, and in this position Stockfish will realize that it loses the control of its dark squares, and especially the dark squares on the king side, because this bishop is too strong. It dominates the dark squares diagonal, and the only reason why it is too strong because the dark squared bishop is uncontested. Therefore, being Stockfish, the world's #1 chess engine, doesn't want to exchange the dark squared bishop with a knight and relocated the bishop or moved the bishop back to d2. The game continued with bishop g7, h3 attacks the knight, and the knight hops back to f6, sorry. d5 attacks the other knight, and the knight hops to e5, offering an exchange of pieces, which the white pieces happily accepted. And in this position, the black's pieces are creating a double pawn weakness. c4 stabilizing the center and vacating the c3 square for the knight later on to develop that way. And the game continued where the black king decides to castle short, and knight c3. e6 attacks the center, d5. This is what I'm talking about, that these engines are fighting for the centers and fighting for central control. Bishop g5 pins the knight. h6 attacks the bishop. Then the bishop retreats to e3, attacking the pawn on c5, which is unattended or unprotected. Ethereal protects this by playing b6, and Stockfish renew a different threat by playing queen d2, creating a battery against the h6 pawn. The king moves up to help out with its defenses. f3 was played, preparing for a massive counter-strike on the king's side, and the center opens up because Ethereal captured the pawn on d5. Now, in this position, which one would you capture back? This pawn or this pawn? Or would you capture it with your knight? Because you cannot allow this pawn to move forward to d4 because it will create a fork. Therefore, this pawn must be captured. Stockfish captured it with the e-pawn. The only idea was to open up the bishop's diagonal, the light squared bishop's diagonal. That's the only idea. And if in this position, if Ethereal or the black pieces decides to develop a piece or make a random developing move or human developing move, such as bishop b7, then in this position the follow-up will be h4, and h5 will follow, which is really dangerous for the black king. Now, in this position, there are like at least three variations. Now, just the bishop move, it creates already 3 variations. Now, I don't want to show you all of them because this video will last more than 1 hour if I will do that. But I will show you one. This is the one that I'm showing you now. This is very close to a human perspective. But all is up to you. Feel free to explore all of them if you want to. I'm just saying that in this position, by moving the bishop to b7, there are already 3 variations. Now, the game continues with a6. Why a6? Because, like I said, the Sicilian is all about the queenside attack, and a6 is preparing for the pawn push to b5. It will create a pawn storm on the queen side. However, like I said, h5 will arrive, and if the knight hops to g8, trying to defend the h6 pawn, which is the most vulnerable one, then the continuation will be pawn takes pawn with a check. Then pawn takes pawn, capturing back. Then knight e4, adding another attacker to the black's king. Then bishop c8. Bishop c8 is only to move the bishop here, trying to lock the diagonal or block the diagonal from the light squared bishop. That's the only purpose there. And help out, controls the center. And the game will continue like this. Knight g5 with a check, and king h8. Then bishop captured the g6 pawn with a threat of knight f7 fork. Then the black pieces will lose the exchange. And the only solution to this is queen d6, which will also lead to a fork. However, it creates counterattack. So Ethereal will play queen d6, and the continuation will be bishop c2, bishop f5, challenging the light square diagonal, and then g4, bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, and the threat is queen h7 with a mate. Now the only move that would prevent checkmate will be knight f6, and in this position the knight will hop to e6, attacking the rook, and the rook moves to e8, attacking the knight, and the queen infiltrate to g6. And if queen defends the bishop, because the threat is mate in one, because it's been attacked twice, so the queen has to move back to e7. Then bishop takes h6, and in this position, I don't want to show it to you, but in this position, according to the engine, there's a mate in 9 moves. And like I said, I don't want to show everything because this video will last for more than an hour. That is why Ethereal moves back the knight to e8, and the only logical explanation to the knight move was to push this pawn, because the knight is blocking it. In order for this pawn to control the center, help out in the center, is to move the knight away. So you cannot move the knight here because it will block the bishop's vision. You cannot also move the knight here because it doesn't make sense. Therefore, this knight is now in e8 because it has some prospects in relocating it to the d6 square. So it's better to hop the knight to e8 rather than in g8. The game continue with Stockfish playing the long castle and the knight to d6. That's what I was saying. And in this position, Stockfish started the attack on the king side with h4. Now, what would you do in this position? Some said that you can push the pawn right here, h5. But h5 is not possible because of the move g4. it will only hasten the end of the Black's king, and it will demolish the defenses on the Black's king side. Therefore, h5 is not possible. Thus, f5 was played in this position. Then g4, trying to smash everything on the king side. Then Ethereal moved the queen to e7, defending or trying to create a counter attack by pushing this pawn. The plan is to push this pawn really and block the bishop's diagonal. Now, in this position, rook d1, rook de1, sorry. So, if in this position f4 was played, because this is another human move before the queen e7. Let's say f4 was played. Then bishop f2, retreating temporarily. Then bishop a6, attacking the vulnerable c4 pawn. Then queen c2, renewing the threat of bishop takes g6 with a check. Then queen e8, defending the pawn. Knight e4, knight takes knight, bishop takes knight. And if the rook defends the pawn, then g5 will totally smash the king side defenses. Queen d6, g takes h, bishop takes pawn, and then h5. It's totally useless. So that is why any other random moves is not possible. f4 is not even possible. It looks good, but it's not possible because of this variation. Now, let's go back to the main game. So queen e7, rook de1, bishop d7, a3, rook a e8, trying to support all its pieces in order to forward this pawn. The idea is only this, to forward this pawn so that the king will be safer. Not much longer, but at least it can hold a little longer. And the continuation will be pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn. Now, the knight can capture it really. The bishop can capture it. And the rook can capture it. But it will only become a target because it will pin the piece. If the knight goes there, then the knight is pinned to the king. Right? And the follow-up will, or the attack will continue, and you can never hold the position any longer. Therefore, the most logical capture and basic or the principled capture will be pawn takes pawn, the g takes f5. However, g takes f5 is now surrendering the file, the G file, which is for Stockfish. G takes f5 is like creating a new highway that will be available in Google Maps sooner or later. Therefore, in this position, because the G6 square is already vacated, Stockfish pushes the pawn to h5, creating a massive threat on the G6 square, which is now available for its pieces to occupy. Game continue with rook g8, trying to hold the position much longer. King b1, trying to get away and preparing for the attack. Queen f7, rook eg1. And I believe that in this position, Stockfish is now ready for its counter-attack on the king side and ready to demolish the king side defenses of the black's position. e4. Now, e4 is a brilliant move. It temporarily holds the position because, like I said, e4 will block the diagonal, the light square diagonal, like this. So now the black pieces can recover for a few minutes or a few moves, but the game will continue with pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn attacking the bishop, and the bishop retreats to e2 temporarily because the light square diagonal is now close for the time being. And Ethereal developed the bishop to f5, hoping that the diagonal will soon open in his favor or in its favor. So in this position, Stockfish moves the king away from the dangerous diagonal by moving to a1. Queen d7, rook g6. A brilliant move, a brilliant rook sacrifice. Now, if you're the one playing with the black pieces, what would you do? That is totally a free rook. So let's say, for example, if bishop takes rook, then the continuation will be pawn takes bishop with a check. And if the king takes the pawn, then bishop h5 with a check. King moves back and the bishop takes the rook. Queen takes bishop and bishop takes the pawn on h6. Well, actually, no, sorry. I think this is not the continuation. Well, let's see. Oh, rook, yeah. Rook h8. Queen f4, Queen g6, and then bishop takes bishop with a check discovered. King takes bishop, Queen e5 with a check. Queen blocks, Queen takes queen with a check, and king takes queen, and the rook falls. And in this position with one piece ahead, I think it's time for Ethereal to resign. There is also another variation. If in this position the king moves back to h8 rather than taking the pawn, right? It's like this at first. Yeah. So pawn takes bishop is a check. And if in this position the king moves back to h8 rather than taking the pawn, because we saw it already that if the king takes the pawn, then it's already a losing position. In this position, Stockfish will sacrifice the bishop again, and it's a brilliant move. And Ethereal cannot hold the position much longer. And that bishop on d4 needs to be captured, otherwise everything is a threatened mate in one. This pawn is attacked twice and its mate. Therefore the bishop needs to be captured, and the follow-up will be rook takes pawn with a check, and bishop takes rook, queen takes bishop, and if the queen covers, and it's the only way, and then checkmate next move. Therefore, the knight hops back to f7, trying to defend the attack h6 pawn. Then the continuation will be bishop f1. Bishop h8, trying to open the file for counter-attack. queen c1, bishop g4, trying to hold the position by blocking the open file. Knight takes e4, and rook takes e4. Rook takes knight, and the continuation will be bishop d3, pinning the rook. Now, if the rook takes the bishop or move elsewhere, then let's say the rook moves away, let's say right here, then rook d6, discovered check, and the queen is lost. Therefore, Ethereal played bishop f5, and the queen creates another battery. Rook ge8, trying to hold its position again, and then rook f1, pressuring or adding another pressure to the bishop. Bishop g7, and let's go back for a bit. Let's say in this position, if the knight hops to d6, trying to defend the attack rook, let's say for example, and the continuation will be rook sacrifice the exchange by taking the knight on d6 square. And if the queen takes the rook, then rook takes bishop. And again, if the rook moves or if the rook captures the bishop, then rook f6 wins the queen again with a discovered check. Therefore, bishop g7 was played, queen g2, renewing the threat. The threat is this one. Rook takes bishop with a check, and the knight hops to g5, blocking the queen's vision, and rook takes bishop with a check. And let's say for example in this position, if the queen takes the rook, then the follow-up will be rook takes bishop, still renewing the threat because this rook is pinned. Any move and this queen is lost. So the game continue with king takes the rook, and bishop takes the knight immediately, and rook blocks the vision of the queen, blocks the open file, and bishop sacrifice again by taking the pawn on h6 with a check. Let's say for example the king didn't move away. Let's say for example if the king takes the bishop, then the continuation will be queen d2, king g7, and the bishop takes the bishop on f5 with a fork. And I don't know how Ethereal will defend this position. It's already losing. Therefore, instead of capturing the bishop on h6, the king moves away to g8. And the game continue with queen h3, bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop. And in this position, it looks like that the white pieces are losing materials or losing the exchange, because white has only a bishop for a rook. And the game continue with a6, d6, forwarding the pawn, the passed pawn, and queen e6, d7, and the rook blocks the promotion square. And in this position, the only winning move is rook f8 with a check. Rook takes rook, of course. Otherwise, it's checkmate. So bishop takes rook, and Ethereal, hoping that the queen will run away, but instead Stockfish sacrifices the queen by taking the rook on d4, and the pawn captured the queen, and the passed pawn promoted to a new one, to a new queen. Queen f7 attacks the bishop. Bishop retreats with a check. King h7. Queen takes pawn on d4, and queen takes pawn on h5, and queen munches the pawn on b6. a5, queen takes pawn, queen f7, queen d5, offering an exchange. Well, this is already a losing position for the black pieces, because it only has a queen and a king, while the white pieces have the bishop and 3 pawns. So the continuation was queen f1 with a check, king a2 hiding, king g6, c5 forwarding another pass pawn, and queen b5 in case the pawn forwards, then the queen is lost. But that never happened, because Stockfish checked the king by playing queen e6, and the king moves to g5, and the pawn again forward 1 square, and there's only 2 squares left for another promotion. Queen a6, trying to pin the pawn so that the pawn can stay there, because if the c pawn forward, then again the queen is lost. However, Stockfish played bishop d6 in case if Ethereal captured the pawn, then bishop e7 with a check, and the queen is gone as well. Queen d3, c7, 1 more square for promotion. Queen f5 challenging, and Stockfish promotes another pawn to c8 with a queen. Queen f4, queen e g8 with a check, king h5, and Stockfish captured the queen on f4. 1 square available for the king, which is the h4 square, and Stockfish finishes the game in style by playing queen h8 with a check, and it's mate. Di nila natataman. Hantod sa sunod. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to all.